Alright guys, you're doing great. I know it's a lot of chemistry, but just stay with me for 5 more minutes. So in our last lesson, we learned a lot about inorganic chemistry. So now we're going to lean onto the organic side. So organic chemistry involves carbons mixing or bonding with hydrogen and or oxygen. We'll typically see these guys forming these really long chains of compounds. So first, let's talk about carbs. Carbohydrates are used to store energy or be broken down for even more energy. And they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen all bonded together. A single unit of carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. Glucose will be an example. Typically, monosaccharides are used directly by the cell for fuel. So when we have two monosaccharides linked together, we call that a disaccharide. And when we have more than two, we call them polysaccharides. An example of a polysaccharide could be starch found in potatoes. So polysaccharides can also be used to build structures like in cells, or they can be used as storage mechanisms for the monosaccharides. So imagine we eat some French fries. Our body takes in that starch, which is a polysaccharide, and breaks it apart and turns it into a bunch of smaller monosaccharides, so that our cells can use that and create energy. When we're done and we don't need any more energy, the body takes those leftover monosaccharides and tries to put them back into polysaccharides and store them for later. Hence why I put on a lot of weight when I eat French fries. Alright, moving on from there, let's talk about lipids, oils, and cholesterols. They're typically made from these long chains of carbons and hydrogens all stuck onto a head or a base unit. Or they form these really intricate ring shapes. So, long chains of carbons, all full with hydrogen. If all the carbons are full of hydrogen ions, then we call that a saturated fat, or a saturated fatty acid. For example, any type of animal fat would be a saturated fat. Interesting thing about saturated fats, they're solids at room temperature. Another type of fatty acids would be unsaturated fatty acids. So in this case, not all of the carbons are full of hydrogen atoms. So an example of these would be like olive oil or sesame oil. Both saturated and unsaturated fatty acids repel water, which is why when you put oil into a pot, it'll separate itself from the water around it. So building off of these fatty acid chains, if we have 3 fatty acid chains that are stuck to a glycerol head or like a sugar head, we'll call that a triglyceride. Remember that example I mentioned earlier about the body taking extra monosaccharides and then turning them into polysaccharides? Well, the body will often take those polysaccharides and turn them into triglycerides for long-term storage. If we need the energy later, we'll break these down, get at the polysaccharides, and then we can break them down further to turn them into glucose. But that's a lot of work, hence why it's really hard to burn off fat once you put on some weight. So next we have phospholipids. If we take a triglyceride and instead of having a sugar head or a glycerol head, we put one there that's made of phosphorus, we have a phospholipid. So the interesting thing about phospholipids is that while the tails repel water, the phosphorus actually attracts it. So this makes phospholipids really useful for building membranes or cell walls, places where you need to separate fluids. Lastly, we have cholesterol. So when you take fatty acids and you form them in a ring shape, you get a cholesterol. So cholesterol is actually really useful to the body. We use it to make hormones and steroids, which help control and regulate our body. The difference between cholesterol and a hormone is that functional unit that sticks on the very end of the ring. Stepping away from fats and lipids, let's move into proteins. Proteins play a huge role in our body, from structures like collagen that hold the body together, to functional proteins that help us do things like enzymes. Proteins are made of amino acids, and they form these really long chains that are then folded and folded and folded into the desired shape. We'll get more into that shaping process when we talk about cells. Amino acids are joined together by covalent bonds, and they're called peptide bonds. Hydrogen bonds will cause these long chains to start to fold in on themselves, going from a perfectly straight line to these weird jagged twisted shapes, called secondary proteins. From there, other forces, like organelles, can fold them into 3D structures, or tertiary proteins. So as I said before, proteins typically either help form structures within the body, and they're called structural proteins, or they help the body perform a specific function, called a functional protein. Sometimes a protein's job is just to speed up or facilitate a particular reaction, and in those cases we would call those proteins enzymes. Alright, next up we've got the big one, nucleic acid. So these are the chemicals that tell the rest of the body how to make particular proteins, carbs, or other chemicals. They can be found in DNA and in your RNA. So nucleic acid is made up of one piece of phosphorus, a sugar, and then a few types of nitrogen bases. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is a twisted helix of billions of nucleic acids that all have a deoxyribose sugar and then one of the following bases kind of paired up: adenine, cytosine, thymine, or guanine. The particular order of the pairs is how DNA transfers information to the rest of the body. RNA, or ribonucleic acid, is used as a messenger or working copy of the DNA, and it's used to transfer the information the DNA has to the rest of the body. It has a ribose sugar and uses adenine, cytosine, guanine, and uracil as nitrogen bases. So, alright, last thing for this chemistry topic. Let's really quickly recap how ATP works and why it's so important to the body. So ATP is made of adenosine and 3 phosphate units. And it's created inside the cell by breaking down sugar and using that energy to force an extra phosphate onto ADP. So that's adenosine with 2 phosphate. Later, when the cell needs energy to do something, it breaks that bond and releases all that energy. So it's kind of like charging up a battery, and then when you need the energy, you just take the energy out. So this whole process is what's called the Krebs cycle. It's a part of the Krebs cycle, which is not something we're going to dive too much into this course, but it's probably worth knowing at some point.